going on a talk show. It just means that you have some self-awareness and that you can modify your system based on your input, your processing, your purpose, and then you can change it to better suit your purpose. That's all. That's consciousness. And that comes in all different degrees and levels. Okay. Next. Okay, now the origins of consciousness kind of flow just like the origins of our biological systems here on this planet. And it comes out in a similar way. You have to hypothesize at the beginning because there were no reporters there, with mics for that first budding consciousness or for that first live, biological cell. Nobody was there to interview it. How did you do that? Where'd you come from? So you have to, it's speculation at a point because it's beyond your ability to gather data. But it works the same way. There's a form of potential energy capable of evolving to lower entropy states, a very dim form of potential energy. Okay, now this, of course, is non-physical because the physical hasn't been invented yet because consciousness is what invents the physical. So just some form of, call it primordial potential energy, if you like. And this form discovers that it can be in two different states. It notices eventually it evolves, it's like the first cell to say, well, I can distinguish between this way and that way. And basically that's all it takes. That's the spark of life in consciousness. It can just decide whether it's this way or that way. So now it finds that it can be in two different states, this or that. Well, it can duplicate that to this and that and the other thing, and this and that and that and this and the other thing. It can differentiate states. It can differentiate more states. So if it can do 2, it can do 3. If it can do 3, it can do 3,000 and so on. And pretty soon you have a thing that's just got in different states. Well, what are states? States are like bits, aren't they? States are, you get 2 states, you get binary, You got an on and off, yes and no. That's the same as a 1 and a 0. So it doesn't matter what this is, whether it's hot, cold, acid, base, vibrating, not vibrating, whatever you want to call it. It's just 2 things that you can differentiate. Well, that creates a binary, and then you get a whole bunch of these little binaries. Then you end up with all sorts of things. The binaries can be put into patterns. The patterns then can develop significance or meaning. Ooh, information. Now you've developed some information, and maybe the information is just a pattern. You made this pattern, and you can make it again. And that may be all the information there. We're talking about something really dim. We're not talking about your consciousness at this point. And then, it can, just like those cells did in biology, it can divide itself up into different kinds of patterns. Then it can let the patterns interact. It may make a pattern this way and one that way and see that they meet. It can do all sorts of things, and eventually you get experience, learning, patterns of patterns. And then comes the big invention, time. Well, what's time? It's just this way, that way, this way, that way. And you do that regularly. Basically, that's a metronome. You've created time. So it's just turning these states on and off. Now, this is a thing evolving. Think of this now as just a thing that's evolving. Potential energy system that found 2 states. It's evolving. And now it's evolved to the point that it can turn those states on and off. It has patterns, and it invents time because time allows it a great leap forward. There's all kinds of other patterns it can develop now in sequence, according to this metronome. So it gives it another whole dimension of lowering its entropy. See, patterns are organization, right? Organization's lowering entropy. Lowering entropy is evolution. And so this system's just trying to evolve. And that's what you end up with then, is this patterns of patterns. You get time. It needs to improve that process. Now that it has all these patterns, what does it do to improve its evolution? It starts breaking itself, cell division, right, into subsets. And it lets those subsets interact with those patterns and patterns of patterns and times and sequences. Because it's just itself, and it's just one thing interacting with itself is kind of limited. But 2 things interacting with each other Now the possibilities just went up. Well, 1,000 things interacting all with each other, the possibilities of what might happen and the patterns you get and the sequences you get just goes up. More and more complex, more and more information, less and less entropy, more organization. So what are these units that it breaks itself into? It's you and you know, it's all of us. We are these units of consciousness. All right. Well, the basic question, of course, you know, well, where'd that potential energy come from? Don't know. You know, there's limits to knowledge. Let's discuss the limits of knowledge. We had this consciousness system that was evolving, basically bootstrapping itself. That's a term I use, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, which means you build something out of nothing. Now that sounds impossible, but that's the same thing an athlete does. You take a person who can't run a mile and you train them to run a mile in less than 5 minutes. They have to bootstrap themselves, which means they have to work at it and work at it. They build up coordination, they build up muscle, they build up ability to process oxygen. All that has to be built up that wasn't there before. And where was it? It's not like they go out and buy it. They've got to create it. They've got to create it out of nothing. They've got to create that muscle just out of using it, and because you use it, it gets stronger. This is the same, you know, it's a similar kind of thing. So there are boundaries to what we can know. So when we get to the point that we can't actually tell you for sure exactly what that digital information system was, and you know, where did that potential come from? Well, we don't know, and here's why we don't know. Okay, in this picture, this little red spot in the center is us. That's our universe. That's the whole physical universe, the little red spot there. Not very big. So the little kind of beige spot that's out around that is what I call our system. And our system is the physical reality, our whole universe, plus all of that non-physical part of the larger reality that deals with our universe. Okay, so our system would be all the entities and things that are non-physical that interact with this physical system. So outside of that little beige thing around the red spot, you know, we have this kind of thing, looks like a lake. That's the larger consciousness system. That's the non-physical. So there's parts of this non-physical system that never interact with our physical system, and that don't even know we exist, and we don't know that it exists. Right? So we're looking at systems inside of systems inside of systems. Well then, what's outside in this dash boundary? What's in this thing? Well, let's call that beyond the larger consciousness system. Okay, now in order to understand reality beyond the red spot, which is our universe, you have to get outside of the red spot. You can't understand this little beige place until you get there and can experience in it. And you can't understand this light blue area until you can get out and interact and experience in it. In other words, you can't define the system you're in from inside of it. You need to get a viewpoint of the next system out in order to be able to look back and understand and assess the next system. So let me reduce this to a physical analogy. Let's say that we're gonna represent our universe. Let's say we are a bacterium, just a lonely bacterium, and we're in the let's say the small intestine of a critter, maybe ourselves. So imagine this one bacteria. Now this bacteria, what it does is it digests food. It breaks things down. That's its job, and it gets input. It gets food from somewhere. You know, manna from heaven, right? Food just appears, and it works on it, and it moves on. And that's all it knows about its reality. Well, what could it understand? It could probably understand, you know, maybe the whole GI tract, if it could get around and up to the next level. Maybe it could understand everything from the, you know, from the teeth or the swallowing, you know, down to the elimination. Maybe. If it could pass word along, you know, up and down the track and that sort of thing. It might figure that much out, but it has to get out of its small intestine to do that, right? It needs to, or the information has to get out. Well, okay, then let's go up to the larger system. That would be the body. Now, what does a bacterium know about the body? What does a bacterium in your digestive tract possibly know about your heart and your liver and your fingers and all that sort of stuff? Nothing. I mean, what would it have? What data? Even if it's a brilliant bacterium. Say this bacteria has an IQ of 200, an absolutely genius bacterium. What could it know? You see, it's limited. Where does the data come from about your fingernails to that bacterium? It doesn't. You know, it has no idea about all the things that are in the body. And it can't know because it can't get out to the next larger system where it can look back down and say, oh, there's a body. I see. I get it. You know, and here's how it's connected. And there's the mouth. Yeah, I know about that. You know, and down there's where I live. It can't do that unless it can get outside the body. Well, it can't get outside the body, so it's limited. But philosophers would often tell you, well, if it's beyond your knowing, then it's irrelevant. It really doesn't make any difference. But see, that's not true. If you're a bacterium, what's in this outside reality out here, which is beyond, 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 that's 3 levels of beyond, makes a very big difference. Because what's outside there for that bacterium isn't just a body, but it's a farm. It's rain, it's sunshine, it's plows, it's trucks, you know, it's horses and cows. It's all those things that end up in that manna from heaven that bacteria knows about and works on. So to say that just because those things are removed beyond your ability to know that they're not important and you can forget about them, that's not true. All that stuff out there is vitally important to that bacterium, but that bacterium just is not in a position to understand sunshine and rain. Sunshine and rain are just outside of what it can do. So my point is here is that reality is a chain. You have systems and systems. The chain is not infinite, but it is beyond your knowing. It's just beyond what you're going to get to. So you're in this little red spot and you go out of body, now you're in that little beige spot. And then you go out of body if you're out of body and you're out here in this blue spot. And you can do that only so far before you're just beyond your ability to understand. So the larger consciousness system, we are consciousness. We can get into that larger system because we are consciousness. We can be in that larger system. That's the blue spot out here. But what's beyond that? How does consciousness get outside of consciousness? You know, how does a bacterium learn about trains that move food or grocery stores or refrigerators or any of that sort of thing or sunshine? It doesn't, you see. So it's not a failure. It's not a failure of science and it's not a failure of your logic to get to a point and say, well, we just don't know. It's not like, well, then, you know, go back to work. You know, if you don't know, you know, go find out. There are certain limits to your knowledge that are just, you have to accept that that's just the way it is. So what you can do, though, is make the most sense out of it as you can. Get it as logical as possible to where you understand it and you can explain all the facts that you have. And that's about all a bacterium is going to do. It can explain that food comes and then what it does with it and maybe where it goes, but it isn't going to go a whole lot further than that because it just can't do it. So we have to accept that. So I can't tell you where that potential energy came from that turned into the consciousness system, but that's just it. You have to accept that and go on. Now, if that's a rational start and then lets you derive the answers that you can tell, then maybe it's useful. We do the same thing in biology. Where did that first biological cell come from? You know, where did those proteins that just happened to get together and those amino acids that ended up producing a cell that then created all the rest of the life forms here? Well, you know, nobody really knows. Say, well, it's just random. You know, it just happened. Well, that's the same as this. You know, same. My answer's the same way. Well, you know, it just happened. So that's kind of where you are, and don't think of it as a failure. As just that you have to realize you can't go but so far, out beyond your own ability to understand. Okay, next. Yeah, just because you can't know everything doesn't mean you can't know anything. there are those who would say, well, if you can't trace it back to the, then you don't know anything. Well, that's not true. You can know a lot within the range that you can experience. Okay, now there's just two assumptions that drive all of this. The whole Big Toe trilogy were just based on these two assumptions. One of it is the one I just talked about. It's a potential energy form, exists. Okay, so the potential for consciousness exists, one assumption. Now, that's really the mystical assumption of these two assumptions, but it's not really a hard one. Anybody have a hard time imagining that consciousness exists? I mean, is anybody conscious? If you're conscious, you ought to be able to say consciousness exists. That shouldn't be a great leap. So that's basically, the potential for consciousness exists. We kind of look back and say, yeah, I think the potential for consciousness must have existed because, here we are. The other thing is that evolution exists. Any system with complex potential outcomes, evolution will direct and encourage a change toward more profitable states of being. Now again, those more profitable states of being, if it's an information system, is lowering entropy, decreasing noise, and that just automatically happens. A system will evolve, will self-change if it has the potential, and it has the potential outcomes that it can choose. It can be in any one of several states, then it'll choose the state that evolves it, makes it a more complex, a lower entropy system. And it just automatically does that. Now, that's not that hard to understand either because we understand biological evolution, and there the criteria, again, are procreation and survival. But if you think about it, procreation and survival can both be reduced to decreasing entropy. Basically, that's the decreasing entropy will end up, given the context of a physical system, into procreation and survival. Getting rid of the randomness, getting rid of the things that don't work, doing the things that do work. It's the standard evolution process. And those are the only two assumptions, basically, that MBT is based on. Next. In summary, consciousness is best modeled as a superset, a self-modifying digital information system capable of computing virtual realities. The larger consciousness system evolves by lowering the entropy of itself. It lowers the entropy by organizing the bits at its disposal into a more profitable configuration. Content creation and reorganization opportunities are generated by using conscious intent to apply free will choice to incoming experience data. And feedback of the result of a previous choice allows us to modify future choice, and then we just go around the thing here. So basically, as it evolves, it finds lower entropy systems. Those are patterns of patterns, time, sequences. It keeps evolving that. It breaks itself into pieces because those pieces can interact and produce greater potential for lowering entropy because now you have more selection, more choices. Every time you have more choices, you have an opportunity to decrease your entropy by making those choices that are increases in organization. So as all that happens, basically you're creating content. You're reorganizing the bits you have. The content's just patterns at that point. You have conscious intent. Well, conscious intent's just evolution, right? Trying to work the system, trying to evolve to get lower entropy states. That's basically what's driving it. That's the purpose. So the conscious intent is the system trying to reduce its entropy, trying to evolve, because remember, it only has two choices: evolve or die. It can grow and become more, or it can start to fall apart and become less. So a system tends to want to grow and become more if it's a system that can self-change. It wouldn't self-change itself into oblivion. If it did, it may then spontaneously erupt again and progress a ways. This may happen 100 times before you actually get one that can continue on. You start with random processes. You finally get a system, and then you have this feedback that loops, and it keeps getting more and more successful at lowering its entropy until eventually you have the kind of consciousness that we experience. So it's just an evolutionary system of digital information. Okay, next. I'm continuing on with the with the summary. Because experience is the generator of input, right? That's our input is experience. Experience is the generator of input. Consciousness facilitates its own evolution by creating many smaller units of consciousness and setting them loose to interact, to evolve with each other, okay? That's us. And it gives them free will. Now, it has to give them free will. Consciousness and free will are a matched set. You cannot have consciousness without free will. You can't have free will without consciousness. But if you have one, you have the other. In other words, you have these independent now units of consciousness, and they have to interact, and they make choices, and by their choices, they either increase or decrease their entropy. Well, it only works if they have free will. The system can't work any other way. The choices have to be independent choices. If they're not independent choices, then you haven't created any new patterns. All you've done is forced the patterns that you've got. In order to create something new, in order to create, basically, you have to allow choice. All right. So we've got purpose and positive direction defined by lowering entropy, and from that idea of lowering entropy comes positive and negative. Positive lowers entropy, negative raises it. That's not hard to understand, right? Good, love, consideration, kindness, all those things kind of create harmony and lower entropy. Things like hate and meanness and nastiness all tend to, fear, all that tends to just make everything buzz around and blow things up and creates entropy, creates disorder. So it all falls out of the same thing. Morality, spiritual growth, they're all defined in terms of a physics term that's measurable called entropy. I get particularly enjoy the idea of love being defined by physics. I like that. Okay. Continuing with this line of thought, experience. So now we've said why there's experience, because you have independent pieces. The pieces have to interact with each other to create experience, to create choice. The experience requires interaction. Okay? In order to interact, if you just have consciousness and feeding data, let's say you have these two units of consciousness and they're exchanging data. Well, what can each one is just getting data and has to interpret it. Another one gets data and has to interpret it. There's very little traction there. There's no rules. How do you know that other consciousness isn't telling you a lie, or isn't just babbling or whatever? You don't. There's no traction. There's no central set of rules that define the game. A game without rules is a very dull game. Okay, think of any game. What defines the game's the rules. Okay, give a bunch of, however many there are, 9 players on each side, and give them a football and say there aren't any rules except get the ball on the other end. You got a real dull game. It's just this big fight, right? And it stays in the center. It doesn't do anything. But by making rules and say, well, you can't do this and you can't do that and you have to do it this way and so on, then you have a game that has strategy, that has, interest. Same with this. So what we need here is a simpler, constrained environment, which is our local physical reality, as an elementary school. It's a place where you can interact, and you get immediate feedback. So if you're an unpleasant, nasty individual, unpleasant and nastiness usually comes to you. You create that. Well, that's your wake-up call to change, to be different. You get feedback almost immediately. You're a kind and loving person. Usually, nice things come back, and that's feedback because kind and loving pays. So you get in this reality frame where you interact with people, and those people challenge you to grow, to lower your entropy. So that's why we need a physical reality, because it's a trainer. It's a trainer where we can interact, but it's not this interact just mind to mind, thought to thought. We have these bodies, and we have to take care of them. We have to, make sense. We have to be rational. We have to do all these things in order to get by, and they all challenge us to grow up. So that's the point of this physical reality. It is a virtual reality trainer for consciousness to grow up. And unfortunately, this is not graduate school. This is maybe daycare. That's about the level we are here. This is daycare. Yeah, I'm exaggerating to say it's an elementary school, but it's more like daycare. And that's the point of then producing of this consciousness system. Now it's an intelligent, by now, it's evolved up to a pretty intelligent conscious system. It's been doing this for a long time. So it realizes that it can evolve more quickly by creating these virtual reality trainers where the individuals have a lot more traction because there's rules and constraints that they have to deal with, and that produces feedback. So that's where we are. So physical reality is a digital-based virtual reality where interactions are constrained according to a given rule set. That rule set is physics. Gravity, F equals ma, all those things that physicists come up with and write in books. That's the rule set. Now, they haven't figured out all the rule set yet. They're still working on that, but that's the rule set that constrains us. And so where did this come from? How did they make this, virtual reality? Well, because you have this big data system, I'm sure it set up a few initial conditions. The initial conditions would have been a certain amount of energy at a certain, in a certain space, and then said, here's the rule set, physics. Now let's let it go. Let the simulation run and see what we get. Well, that's the big digital bang, right? You start out with a bunch of energy that's all tight in a wad, and you give it certain parameters. These are your initial conditions. And you have a simulation, you have the rule set called physics. So you punch the run button and it goes. The big digital bang happens, and you calculate out a system, and you maybe have to do that 10,000 times, and maybe eventually you get one it results in something stable, and it evolves in your simulation. So then the planets coalesce and this and that and suns and all this kind of stuff, and eventually you end up with a planet like ours, that gets that just by chance